Good afternoon, or yes, it is the afternoon. My name is Jerry White, and I've seen lots of great presentations, and there's lots of good discussion. Uh, this is the data I'm going to be talking about was collected by the government of Newfoundland and Labrador, so they have a fair amount of sway in terms of the participation rate in the study. They're able to, I guess, not bully or harass the schools to participate, so the participation rate is quite good. Now, I should mention, we need to talk about the importance of schools and the importance of schools for children who are being bullied or cyberbullied. My mother had to teach herself how to read and write, so she had no formal education. My father had grade 3, so he didn't have much of an education either. I mean, they were very intelligent without having the school system to help them, but we grew up as a family without having parents who could really help us get through, and I would attribute my obtaining a PhD to the school system. If I had been bullied and harassed, I wouldn't have had the kinds of resources that the schools gave me. So I see it, the school's role in helping those kids who have been bullied and getting out of that situation, because there are 3 determinants of health: safety, education, and healthy child development, and that's what schools need to do. So this is an overview of my presentation, a definition of cyberbullying, and you would have all been exposed to that over the course of this conference. Health-related problems, prevalence, differs from traditional types of bullying, takes many forms. The methods for this research, the results, findings on cyberbullying victimization, conclusions, sources, and acknowledgement. So willful and repeated harm inflicted through the use of computers, cell phones, and other electronic devices. So that's cyberbullying. And there are various definitions within the literature. Health-related problems. Harms associated with cyberbullying include academic, social, and emotional. These harms include school absenteeism, anxiety and depression, suicidal ideation, and in some cases, suicide. Now, the number of suicides that are related to cyberbullying directly are much smaller than the implications associated with other types of bullying. You're more likely to have anxiety and depression related to it if you look at the numbers of cases. So prevalence, it can be as low as 10% and up to 70%, as we saw earlier on. It depends on the development in terms of the education and awareness that are happening within those particular populations. And I would say in the Scandinavian countries it's closer to 7% or 8%. It differs from traditional types of bullying, and this is what makes cyberbullying insidious. It can reach a much larger audience, and it can do so in a very quick fashion. The person carrying out the cyberbullying may be less aware or unaware of the consequences of the actions. As a result, there may be few opportunities to display empathy or remorse, making it difficult for intervention. So they don't actually see the victim when they're doing the cyberbullying, but often in the research that I've done, they're not only cyberbullying the child, they're also physically, socially, and verbally doing it the same way. So we need to look in terms of cyberbullying in terms of the other types of bullying that these kids have to go through when they're in the school or in the classroom. And it can be stopped by blocking the bullying, but kids can be creative as well, and they can find ways of getting around that. And it does not cause direct physical harm. So it takes many forms, sending cruel, vicious, and sometimes threatening messages. But this is also done on the school grounds as well. Creating websites that have stories, cartoons, pictures, and jokes ridiculing others. Again, these are things that happen within the school and on school grounds as well. Posting pictures of classmates online and asking students to rate them with questions such as, who is the biggest? And this has happened in my province, in Canada, where they have who is the ugliest person within the school. And it can be very, very difficult on, a teenager when I go to conferences, I often wonder about what I'm going to wear, whether or not I should wear a suit, and I'm over 50 years of age. So I can imagine what it's like when you're kind of developing. Breaking into an email account or sending vicious and embarrassing materials to others, engaging someone in instant messaging, tricking that person into revealing sensitive information and forwarding the personal information onto others. And that can be quite cruel because at that age, they have a tendency to divulge information. They may have an alcoholic parent, and that's what the bully will use against that particular individual. So information on that person can be quite devastating for that person. So methods, data collection phase for the school climate study, and this is something that my province have been doing for the last 4 or 5 years. The data was collected in March 2014, so for the 2014-2015 school year. There are 226 schools. There are over 25,000 students that participated in this study. Now, keeping in mind that the government, I'm not sure if the schools are mandated, but there's, I guess, a perceived feeling that they need to participate. These are grades 7 through 12. There's a very, very high participation rates, and if we had a little more time, we could discuss some of the problems related to having a student fill in one of these surveys and hand it to a particular teacher. The information is put on what are called scan sheets, and that information is scanned in. So the data can be collected and given back to each school rather quickly. And they have the opportunity to look at their school in relation to the overall school district. The results. So I'm happy to say that the prevalence of cyberbullying within my province is much lower than it is in South Africa. And I would like to think that's because we've had, our schools have a safe and caring schools policy, and that there's a greater emphasis on stopping it. And so these are the rates just for cyberbullying the past month. The students aren't given a definition of what cyberbullying is. They're just given a single question and asked if they've never been cyberbullied, or once a week, or many times a week. So this is the prevalence of cyberbullying victimization over the past month by gender. And if you look at the slide, you will see that females are more likely to be victims of cyberbullying. When I did my doctoral research, this was the same case as well. I've heard some other information where males are more likely to be victims of cyberbullying. But I think the literature will tell you that females are more likely to be the victims of cyberbullying. So this data gives you a sense of whether or not different grade levels, the numbers are higher. And as you can see from this particular pattern, well, there really isn't a pattern. Grade 7s are just as likely to be a victim of cyberbullying as are the grade 12 students. So the red indicates whether or not the grade level, the students in that particular grade level were cyber victims. So a lot of the research I've heard about when it comes to talking about cyberbullying, it's almost like that's the only thing that ever happens to that child, that they've been cyberbullied, or they cyberbullied someone, or they've been a victim of that. But we also need to look at it in relation to the other types of non-traditional, or the types of traditional types of bullying that are taking place in the school. So if you look at that, if you've never been a victim of physical bullying, you're less likely to be a victim of cyberbullying. But if you're a victim of physical bullying, you are at a greater risk of being a victim of cyberbullying. So that's that number over there, the 40.7. So once again, this is looking at verbal bullying. And what you'll find that there is a good relationship between verbal bullying or social bullying and cyberbullying, because they're just using those techniques online. So again, if you've never been a victim of verbal bullying, you're less likely, 3.5% of those who were never victims of verbal bullying are actually cyberbullying in my particular province. So again, we need to tackle the traditional forms of bullying in order to get at the cyberbullying victimization. So again, we see a similar pattern. So students who are victims of a particular type of bullying are more likely to be a victim of cyberbullying later on. And so sexual harassment. So once again, we see a similar pattern. But in this case, if you're a victim of sexual harassment, you're a little more likely to be a victim of cyberbullying. Okay, so these are the variables that I have. I did a logistic regression where I looked at those who were never victims of cyberbullying versus those who have had at least one encounter during the month. These are the independent variables: grade level, whether or not they've been a victim of the traditional types of bullying, such as physical, verbal, social, whether or not students feel respected within the schools, whether or not there's a respect for diversity. And I think that's really important, because if you have more diversity within the schools, you're less likely to see any type of bullying taking place, as well as cyberbullying. Respect for teachers as well, teacher qualifications, and perceived quality of education. Now, the variables that are significant, you'll see over there, the SIG value. The ones that are less than 0.05 are significantly different and are having an impact. So I'll ignore the grade level, but the more important ones are whether or not you've been a victim of verbal bullying. Those who've been victims of verbal bullying are 5 times more likely to be a victim of cyberbullying than if they had not been. So that's the number over that column, 5.113. So all those other types of victimizations in terms of social, sexual, and physical have greater odds ratios than any other of the variables that are among those particular variables. Respect for diversity, respect for teachers, and teacher qualifications are what are called protective factors, where students perceive their respect for diversity, respect for teachers, and teacher qualifications. The students in those schools are less likely to be victims of cyberbullying. So findings on cyberbullying victimization. Girls are more likely than males to be victims in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. Students in grades 7 through 12 are about as likely to be victims of cyberbullying across the board. Students who are victims of traditional types of bullying, such as physical, verbal, social, are more likely to be victims of cyberbullying than those who are not. There's less cyberbullying victimization when students respect teachers, teachers are perceived as qualified, and there's respect for racial diversity. And there is more cyberbullying victimization when students come to schools with higher levels of fear and antisocial behavior. Those were not factors that were, I think that's something that's coming from my doctoral research. So conclusions. Despite what many bullying researchers contend, cyberbullying victimization is linked to the traditional types of bullying. And I've seen here at this conference that that's not quite the way that it used to be before. I think there's the feeling is that there is much greater relationship between what happens with traditional bullying and cyberbullying than has been in the past. And research on cyberbullying really only started in 2004. And when I was doing my doctoral research and collecting my data in 2008, my doctoral committee told me I should be taking out the research on cyberbullying because it wasn't related to what was happening within the schools. So it wasn't that long ago that there was that feeling. including some of my committee members, but I kept it in there. So to decrease cyberbullying victimization, schools need to create positive school climates where all actors respect one another. Future research must focus on types of leadership exhibited in schools where there are lower levels of cyber and school level bullying. And one of the things I've tried to do certainly with my doctoral research, and what I will try and do in future research, is emphasize leadership. And by leadership, I'm talking about the principal in our schools in Newfoundland and Labrador, and creating a sense of distributed leadership where everyone in that school feels like they have a role to play in combating or dealing with bullying in the schools. So I think that's where the next level of research needs to go. We need to, because some of the presentations that I've seen, the participation rate in surveys when it comes to principals is very, very low in terms of 10% response rates or 27% response rates. So that's what we need to do. So in terms of, if you read through the literature, there are very few studies that focus in on leadership. And certainly when I was doing my doctoral research, I couldn't find many studies that looked at the role of leadership within the schools. So I think that's where we need to go, because a lot of the presentation, I think we know that anti-bullying programs, when they're implemented and there's a strong fidelity to the programs, that these anti-bullying programs do work. It's hard to put them in place and hard to sustain them, but when everyone has a buy-in to what's happening, there's less likely to be bullying and cyberbullying taking place in those schools. And I think we're finding that schools with positive school climates are less likely to have victims and bullies within their schools. So, so I have a few sources, and I'd have to thank the government of Newfoundland and Labrador for allowing me to use this data. I also have data on parents and teachers as well, and their perceptions of the school climates as well. And so we all need to come together to deal with this issue. We can't act in silos and do it for our own personal gain. We need to do it for the students who are in class, and certainly the ones who are being victimized, because they are the ones that need the help, including the bullies, because they don't go on to have very glamorous lives either. So we need to concentrate on those as well. So that's it.